Hi everyone, good morning. Great, we've got slides. I think I've had the chance to meet or see on Zoom pretty much everyone by now, but for anyone who is new, my name is Courtney Cooperman. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm one of the housing advocacy organizers here on the NLIHC team. I'm also kind of the lead point of contact for NLIHC's nonpartisan Our Homes, Our Votes campaign, which aims to boost voter turnout among low-income renters and to elevate housing as an election issue. I'm going to kick off this morning's program with a brief overview of the campaign and some of the resources that we have available to support your nonpartisan election work. Then we'll move into a panel discussion with some of our state and tribal partners and a special guest to discuss some tips and strategies for your election work. And then we'll actually have some breakout sessions. You'll have a chance to sit down, put pen to paper, and start to kind of synthesize these ideas from the presentation and the panel and think about what potential voter and candidate engagement activities you might want to pursue and put together some plans for doing so. And I also just want to thank the State and Tribal Partner Caucus of the board for being enthusiastic about having this program on the agenda for the convening. I know it's very common to consider odd-numbered years as off years for elections, but as you'll hear from our panelists, one of the keys to a strong civic engagement campaign is that it doesn't just take place during what we think of as election season. It's something that's ongoing. So by virtue of the fact that we're having this conversation today, I know that we're all going to be in a really strong position for strong nonpartisan election plans in this election cycle of 2023, and of course the big one of 2024. So thank you all for joining me in making 2023 a year on and not a year off for Our Homes, Our Votes. Just to get started, this is probably familiar information for a lot of you, but grounding us in why this work matters for organizations that are committed to achieving racially and socially equitable housing policy. Boosting voter turnout among low-income renters is really essential to achieving those goals, because one of the reasons why federal housing policy and housing policy in general tends to cater towards the interests of homeowners and sideline the needs of low-income renters is because homeowners and higher-income people are more likely to turn out to vote. In the 2020 presidential election, 71% of homeowners voted, compared with just 55% of renters, and that disparity is even more stark between high-income people and low-income people. Of course, elected officials care about getting reelected and keeping their jobs, so they have the incentive to pay more attention to their constituents who vote at higher rates. And the reason why we see these disparities is because the same communities that face the greatest obstacles to securing stable, accessible, affordable housing also face the greatest barriers to voting. That may include less flexible work schedules, lack of transportation, less access to voter ID in states with stricter requirements. They're disproportionately impacted by polling place closures and other deliberate voter suppression tactics. On top of all of that, there's also just a sense of skepticism that voting is worth their time because public policy has consistently failed to meet their needs. We end up in this cycle of non-responsive policy, skepticism of the political process, non-participation, and then, of course, policy that continues to be unresponsive. Fortunately, the people in this room are the people with the power to break that cycle. As housing organizations, we have a lot of trust and credibility to convey why voting matters and the impact it can have on the communities that we serve and work with. We can remind community members that it's important to elect leaders who will strengthen and expand access to housing programs. We can engage voters with a positive message and convey optimism about the possibility of voting to achieve social change and address the issues they're personally facing. And evidence shows that these efforts work. According to research from Nonprofit Vote, engagement with nonprofits is proven to significantly increase turnout among voters traditionally overlooked by political campaigns, which includes voters who move often, low-income voters, and returning citizens. In 2020, low-income voters who were engaged by nonprofits had a voter turnout rate 7 percentage points higher than comparable low-income voters who were not engaged by nonprofits. So we know that these efforts work. We also know that you're all incredibly busy and that running voter engagement campaigns may not be your number one strategic priority, and it may feel like a really big thing to add to your already very, very full plates. That's where Our Homes, Our Votes comes in. Our goal is to provide the tools and resources that make it as accessible as possible for you to engage in nonpartisan election work. And that brings me to the next little piece of this presentation, which is an overview of some of the tools and resources that we have available on our website, which is ourhomes-ourvotes.org. We have resources related to pretty much every aspect of voter and candidate engagement. I'll start with some of our voter engagement resources. We break down voter engagement into 3 categories: voter registration, voter education, and voter mobilization, or what you might have heard of as Get Out the Vote, or GOTV. And we have resources and templates related to all of them. These are just a snapshot that looked pretty on the slide. So for voter registration, you'll find some tips for voter registration, best practices for registering low-income renters specifically, and a list of potential partners and external resources to support your activities. For voter education, we have a template voter guide, which is basically a place where you can fill in the deadlines and the logistics of voting and what voters should expect on their ballots that's catered to your own community, since of course those vary geographically significantly. Distributing a voter guide is a really great way to educate your constituency about how to vote and what to expect on the ballots, so they can feel much more confident when they're walking to their polling place or when they're filling out their mail-in ballots. For voter mobilization, you'll find a fillable voter pledge card where it's a 2-part resource. Basically, the voter fills out their information. You keep the half with their contact information, and they keep the half with a reminder about Election Day and logistics of voting. So then you can follow up with them in the lead up to Election Day once they've registered and make sure they have the plan to vote. We also have resources related to candidate engagement, which is a key way to build relationships with potential future elected officials, to elevate housing in the political conversation, and to push candidates to have strong, affordable housing platforms. We have tips for nonpartisan candidate visits and forums and town halls, and we have a sample nonpartisan candidate questionnaire. And sending this kind of questionnaire to all candidates in the race is a really great way to get them on the record about housing issues and to push their campaigns, to make sure that their campaigns actually have answers to these questions, and if they don't, to get them thinking about it. There's also some tips from our partners at Boulder Advocacy, which is a project of the Alliance for Justice, on keeping all of these candidate engagement efforts nonpartisan, and we link to those external resources on our website. You can find all of the most essential voter and candidate engagement resources in the Voter and Candidate Engagement Toolkit, which is on the website. We also have a QR code to that at the Our Homes, Our Votes table that you'll be able to find during the forum. We also have a media toolkit with sample op-eds, social media content, and other materials which you can use to amplify the importance of housing as an election issue and further spotlight your election work. And last but not least, we have a series of reports on housing-related ballot measures, including a guide to organizing a successful ballot measure campaign and a comprehensive overview of ballot measures from the November 2022 elections. The website is just one of many ways that we work to empower all of you to get involved in elections. In 2022, we had a whole bunch of activities going on. I'm just going to give a brief overview of these. Some of these were sort of time-bound in 2022, and we'll restart them again later this year or next year, and some of these are ongoing efforts. Last year, we hosted a bi-weekly webinar series featuring experts with frontline experience in election work. You can find the archive of all of those webinars on our website, and we'll plan to relaunch another series like that next spring. We also published a regular newsletter with national updates, research updates, spotlights from the field, basically a lot of different highlights of innovative voter engagement work, And going into next year, we'll resume these sorts of features and collections of resources in our weekly memo to members and in our Friday newsletter, The Connection. And of course, if you ever have news from your community, events to spotlight, we always welcome those as features. Please feel free to send them to me. We celebrated the National Nonpartisan Civic Holidays, including National Voter Registration Day, and we shared out information about these opportunities with our partners, really bridging the affordable housing world and all of these civic engagement mobilizations going on to make sure that our communities are involved. We published an edition of Tenant Talk magazine on voter and candidate engagement with useful resources for tenants, including a snapshot of voting requirements in every state and perspectives from people with lived experience on why political engagement matters to them. We recruited a network of Our Homes, Our Votes affiliates, including some of you, which are organizations that are officially identified with the campaign and committed to carrying out its goals. Being part of this network is a great way to exchange ideas, to hear from others in the community about what they're doing, and to celebrate the achievements of peer organizations. It's never too late to join this network. We have an active listserv, so talk to me if you'd like to join. We gave presentations like this one, both in person and virtual, for local, state, and national audiences about why voter engagement matters for housing advocates and steps they can take in their campaigns. I mentioned the ballot measures reports already. That was a big part of our work last year, and of course we continue to track ballot measures in local elections this year, and we'll do so again in 2024. And we also reconvened the Housing Providers Council, which is a group of dozens of affordable housing developers and property managers that are committed to resident civic engagement. This group launched something that we call the Welcome to Vote Pledge, which is a joint declaration of commitment to integrating voter registration into the lease-up process. The idea here is basically that through the National Voter Registration Act, DMVs and other agencies are required to integrate voter registration. So when you go to apply for or renew your license, you can simultaneously register to vote. It's not a requirement for federally subsidized housing providers to offer that, but why not? There's a bill called the Our Homes, Our Votes Act that would make that requirement applicable for all, but in the interim, before this bill is passed, we're showing that there is widespread support for it in the affordable housing sector, and these groups are all kind of taking steps to implement that pledge. So again, if you are not involved in the Housing Providers Council, but you have developers and property managers in your network, definitely a really great opportunity to plug in. So as I mentioned, some of these activities were sort of time-bound for 2022 and are on hiatus and will relaunch, but Our Homes, Our Votes is very much still active this year. A lot of these activities are still going on. We have three main kind of buckets of goals for Our Homes, Our Votes this year. The first is to build our base and sustain momentum. The second is to continue our education about ballot measures. And the third is to prepare to launch our 2024 presidential campaign. Building our base basically involves deepening engagement with and recruiting more members to the Housing Providers Council and Affiliates Network, continuing to meet with the Housing Providers Council, and to meet with a set of core leaders that were involved in Our Homes, Our Votes 2022, and of course spreading the word about the campaign through workshops like this one. If you're interested in, again, joining any of these meetings, it's all very open. We're eager to have anyone that's looking to get more involved. For ballot measures, in addition to tracking ballot measures in local elections, we're also working on a two-part webinar that'll be sometime later this spring or early summer that will dive deeper into what it takes to enact a housing ballot measure, so certainly stay tuned for that. And for candidate engagement, we'll be looking to replicate the successes of our efforts in 2020 and adapt what worked from this presidential season to what will look like a different field and a different context. Just taking a little trip down memory lane, our candidate engagement in 2020 really did spark a sea change in the way that housing is discussed as an election issue. More than 1,000 organizations, including many of yours, joined a sign-on letter to the primary debate moderators that urged them to ask a question about affordable housing. And for the first time in history of televised presidential debates, they did. We took out an ad in the LA Times. It was a whole very big campaign. And our outreach to candidates also led to more than a dozen primary candidates releasing some of the strongest affordable housing platforms for housing in history. We'll also relaunch this debate sign-on letter later this year, and we're currently strategizing around what it will look like to engage with candidates in the context of 2024, which again will be a very different field. Regardless of what that field looks like, no matter what, we will be working strategically to encourage candidates to release strong housing plans and keep housing in the headlines. Affordable housing is a top issue for voters of both parties. I pulled some polling statistics that the Opportunity Starts at Home campaign did, that highlights just how important this issue is to voters across the aisle. And of course, together we have the power to ensure that candidates and the media treat it as the popular issue that it is, and to demonstrate that low-income renters are an important voting bloc that will hold their elected officials accountable. That brings me to the end of this intro presentation. With that, I'm going to invite up our three panelists, Chris Bowen from SCANF, Lisa Chapman from Michigan Coalition Against Homelessness, and our special guest, Morgan Murray from the League of Women Voters. Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us on this panel and for taking the time to prepare and to be here today. I will turn it over to each of you to give a brief introduction of yourself and your organization. We can start with Chris.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Good to see many of you again, and pleasure to meet some of you all for the first time. Chris Bowen with the Southern California Association of Nonprofit Housing. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about what we've been doing in Los Angeles and more broadly in Southern California. Looking forward to it.
Morning, everyone. I'm Lisa Chapman. I'm the Director of Public Policy for the Michigan Coalition Against Homelessness. And we are a 30-year-old nonprofit C3 organization. We're also a member organization. And we do a lot of advocacy, education, policy work, and we also run a data system in Michigan.
Hello, everyone. My name is Morgan Murray. I'm the Voter Engagement Program Manager with the League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan, nonprofit, grassroots organization, civic organization, and we turned 103 this year. So we've been around for a while. We came out of the suffragist movement and really wanting to educate women on their newfound power to vote. So the League of Women Voters is the largest volunteer-run, on-the-ground organization for voter registration, and the League of Women Voters also does influence public policy through education and advocacy and voter mobilization. But I'll be talking more about our voter engagement today.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. As I shared before, low-income people and renters are less likely to be registered and turn out to vote. How do each of your organizations build trust with communities that have historically been excluded from the democratic process and may feel skeptical about their reasons to participate? We can start with Lisa.
Okay. I think partially because we were a known entity. You know, we have members and we have a lot of partners in the homeless response system around the state, the COCs, some housing developers, so they were familiar with us for some of the other work that we do around training and knowledge exchange, and certainly advocacy and policy work. We intentionally shared a lot of info, both from League of Women Voters and from National Low-Income Housing Coalition. They have amazing materials, but also shared information about marginalized populations and, you know, voting incidents among low-income people, people of color, a lot of racial disparities amongst people in terms of voter registration and actually getting to the vote. So, one example is fewer than 10% of people experiencing homelessness vote, despite over 60% of them being eligible. So just really trying to compel people, like, this is really an issue, and people need to really pay attention and try and do what they can to help people vote. We shed a light on the importance of voting. Some of the materials that we produced ourselves, and I had amazing interns that worked with me on this project, but just voting history in America started out with like Washington, and it was really, do you still have that? It's a great piece. We can share it out, but just looking at different populations and when they gained the right to vote, and just really the importance of racial justice in this whole space. The ease of assisting people to vote, like, when they sign their lease or when they get their, ID or license, and just some of the target populations that have a lower incidence of voting. I think that was really important for us to highlight some of those things.
Thanks. Morgan.
Sure, yeah, and I think a lot of our work is around, centering people and the importance of the voice of the people. And so, when we work with organizations is, really, giving allyship and support to communities. Communities know their issues. They know the issues they're facing. They know the solutions. And so, voting isn't an end-all, be-all, but it is a start in, a tool to kind of get to some of the solutions that communities are facing. And so just making sure to, know the right messenger. Maybe it's someone in the community and not, League of Women Voters. And so just being very conscious about, making sure the people's voices are heard, and, we can be a support in, really engaging voters and providing that important information and education.
Thank you. Chris.
All right, first of all, Morgan had a great introduction. I felt very subpar with my introduction, so I want to go back for a second. Also, there was a layover. We're coming from California, so some of us from California are a little, so I bet you guys are feeling a little tired, a little dreary, but we're here. But anyway, so a little bit of background on my organization. We do represent 5 counties in Southern California, which encompass about 20 million people. So that's Los Angeles County, Orange County, Ventura County, San Bernardino. You've probably seen some of the mountains and the snow. We get snow in Southern California over the last couple of weeks, and Riverside County. So there's a lot of ground to cover, a lot of people to reach out to, and there's 11 people on our staff. And I think that's probably a situation that many of you are encountering as well. A lot of work to be done and only a certain amount of man hours available. And so what can we do to reach out to residents of affordable housing and get them engaged in the electoral process? Well, I am the organizer at SCAMP. I guess I didn't even introduce myself as to what my title was either, so really whiffing already this morning. But I am the organizer, so I actually go door to door. I work with our affordable housing developers inside of SCAMP. We're made up of hundreds of members, about 300 affordable housing developers, individuals, and agencies, government agencies. And so it's kind of a unique situation, but we're able to gain access to buildings because of members, actually like NLIHC Board Chair Dora Gallo with the Community of Friends, who is here this morning. But we work with her and many of our members to go door to door and speak directly to the residents of affordable housing. And we worked on the census in 2020, getting folks registered to vote. As you know, a lot of those census tracts deeply undercounted for low-income communities, communities of color, and that is done by design. But we are doing our best, all of our organizations, to make sure that folks are registered to vote and that they know what is on the ballot, but making sure that things are distributed in multiple languages. In the city of Los Angeles, English as the primary language at home is less than 50%. And so we've got to be speaking to people in the languages that they understand. That's really important. And someone else on the panel mentioned making sure that we are doing education on racial justice and speaking to people and the history that matters to them. So a lot of civic engagement, showing up at resident meetings, so not just showing up when you need a vote, but going regularly and speaking and having relationships with people. So going to those resident meetings, tenant meetings, just being a regular face, and that's really important to build trust.
Thank you. Diving a little bit deeper into this same topic, so we talked about skepticism of voters that have historically been excluded and haven't had their needs met by public policy. What messages are effective, what tactics are effective in registering and mobilizing these voters? Maybe if there's like a conversation, how one of those conversations might typically go, that would be really interesting. Maybe we start with Morgan on this one.
Sure. And I think, thinking about voters and, communities may not be, they're not monoliths. And so, really finding out the issues that are important to the community. Maybe you have a community with a lot of parents and, education and school safety is important. So thinking about connecting those issues with voting and how and why voting is important. So, thinking about the school board and, what role the school board plays, as well as, electing people to the school board that, have the same or similar values to produce some of those outcomes. Maybe policing is an issue in the community, and thinking about how, mayors and police commissions, appoint and then also how like sheriffs are, also elected. And so thinking about some of those issues that the community are facing. I know a lot of panelists have already talked about, also barriers to people actually turning out to vote. So, thinking about restricted voter ID. Do people not have voter ID? Do they not have, the information? Do they not have, a way to get to the polls? And are there resources in your community that you can, push out to the members that can kind of combat those issues? We do have an election resources website, vote411.org, and I use it every time I'm going to vote, but we push that out to people. You can register to vote, you can check your registration, you can find your polling place, you can see exactly what's on your ballot, you can see how candidates have answered questions, in their own words to the surveys that we've put out, and so thinking about some of the resources in the community that can really combat those issues that people are facing to actually register to vote or like get out to vote.
We did a number of different things, and we shared your materials. You have amazing materials. So we used everybody's materials as well as creating our own. But one of the kind of intentional things that we did was to talk about the election at every opportunity. We started out in January once we knew we were doing the work, and it was the first time for me and for my 3 interns in doing this work. So we talked about the election and voting every meeting, every webinar, every legislative action committee meeting that I held. I always had a slide. Our homes, our votes. We got swag and wore our buttons and just everything. And we tried a variety of methods. We held webinars. We recorded them. We had meetings. We did a few in-person events. We pushed out a lot on our different social media channels. We had a dedicated page on our website. I also wanted to mention that USICH also has some great materials on folks voting, especially folks experiencing homelessness. So we also use their materials as well. And one of the things that we did was use compelling stats. I mentioned, some of them early on about why it's important to vote. But also, we tried to just influence people, in different ways. So we also used quotes. I love using quotes, and we used quotes from, famous people and not so famous people. So here's one that we had, that we highlighted. The vote is precious. It is almost sacred. It is the most powerful, nonviolent tool we have in a democracy. And that was from former U.S. Congressman John Lewis. And so we just had a variety of things that we did. We also had different themes. We, towards the end, closer, like the summer and closer to the election, we had a theme each week because we really found that people were not paying attention. You know, a lot of our partners, they were busy, the NOFO came out. There were a lot of other things to pay attention to, and the election's not till, you know, the primary's not till August, the election's not till November, so we had to really try and focus on, you know, different aspects, like, you know, why is the primary important? And we did a whole thing around that and materials around that. And just highlighting, you know, sometimes how few votes determine an election. So there's some of the things that we did, and I think I'll leave it at that.
Well, Morgan and Lisa covered a lot of good material, but when we did the outreach on the census, we talked about roads, services, hospitals, recycling, things like that. When I went to those tenant meetings, oftentimes there would be representatives from the city, and we would be hearing the residents really disaffected with the system and saying, we're not getting our fair share, the recycling doesn't come on time, the trucks are rolling by at 3 in the morning, and what can we do about that? The train is, and why is this happening to our neighborhoods and it's not happening in other neighborhoods? And I said, when I get up, I said, well, if we show up to vote, that is going to have a deep impact on who is listening and who is not listening. And I'm really excited. I don't want to share the stats yet because I know we have some. But it does make a huge, huge difference when you go and speak to those residents and they realize that and realize that people are actually paying attention and caring. So we'll come into a building and say, the last election cycle, we noticed that only 30% of you voted. And I think that jars people. They're like, how did you know? You know, how did you know that? You know, like, oh, geez, you know, like, maybe I should vote next time. So I think that just them realizing their own power and us recognizing that helps them engage in the process.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely give people a little bit of a shock. Start looking at each other. Who did this? Who didn't? Great. Question for Lisa and Chris. So as I talked about, one of the goals of Our Homes, Our Votes is to elevate housing as an election issue and encourage candidates to release strong housing plans. Can you talk a little bit about your engagement with candidates in recent election cycles, some events, questionnaires, and what you learned from those activities?
All right. So we had quite a few candidate questionnaires because, like I mentioned, there's 11 people on staff. And so how can we cover 5 counties and from people running from city council to municipalities of 20 and 30,000 and then major metropolitan areas like the city of Los Angeles. And so we have to prioritize who's getting a candidate questionnaire and then who's writing that questionnaire on staff, and then who's following up with the campaign to make sure that those questionnaires are filled out. And then when do we actually lean into the candidate forum? Who's actually going to show up in the press, and how are we going to influence the election? And so, of course, for the bigger elections, we try to do the candidate forums. So most recently in the city of Los Angeles, we worked with a group called Housing for Stronger Los Angeles. And it's a group of executives of nonprofit affordable housing developers, and they put together a platform. And this group has been in existence for over 10 years. Actually, Dora has been a member of that group for some years, and they did a candidate forum in 2013 for the mayor, and that was Eric Garcetti, who just last week became the ambassador to my home country of India, which is kind of cool. But what we did is make sure that the candidates understood what was important for affordable housing production and preservation. And in the last 5 years, at least in the city of Los Angeles and Southern California, it's become a trendy topic and people really want to lean into it. But it certainly wasn't the case 10 years ago and beyond. So just making sure that those candidates know that those issues are front and center, and then getting those questionnaires. And I'll tell you that in one of those questionnaires, or not one, all of the questionnaires, we ask, if you are elected, will you be willing to meet with our organization within 100 days? And you better believe that I follow up on those questionnaires and say, hey, you said that you were going to meet with us within 100 days. And they do it. And so we bring executives of affordable housing development as well as residents who have lived experience to share their policy views with the elected official. And they walk out with their staff and say, wow, I had no idea. Can we put together a regular standing meeting where we can get feedback from you all, because we love this level of expertise. But without that questionnaire, we wouldn't have that leverage.
So being a statewide organization, we had a little different implementation than what Chris did, but so Micah's done this work for years, and so we have a track record of doing the candidate surveys and questionnaires. But this year, last year when I came in, I decided to do it differently. They had done a mail, fill out the paper survey, and we decided to do it electronically. We also decided to cut it down a little bit and ask fewer questions to try and raise our rate of response. For some reason, we decided it would be a good idea to do it pre and post primary. Thank you.
There you go.
Lost the word. Yeah, primary, which tended to be not a good decision, but we did it anyway. For some reason, it was challenging to get some of the, if you think you're a candidate and you're running for office, you think your contact information would be readily available on your Facebook. Luckily, one of my interns had been a reporter and was amazing at researching. So just finding the email to send the electronic survey was a challenge in some cases. But he called all the clerks and engaged all the clerks because we did our state legislature, both Senate and House. We did our congressional, those races. We didn't have any Senate races last year. And then we did our executive office, which we never got any responses from them, unfortunately. And I know they get a lot of, people asking them to fill out surveys, including yours. But so we did get a decent return rate, not as much as we wanted, but we had to follow up with people. But we did focus on, housing views and ending homelessness. We had, rate 1 to 5, the importance of, affordable housing. Do we have the right tools for ending homelessness? Different things like that. We also tried to do town hall events, partnering with some of our COC partners, our community partners. We did not get any takers for a variety of reasons. I think some because the NOFO was out in the summer. I also think people weren't still doing a lot of in-person events, at least, in Michigan. Or they had no bandwidth to pull something off. So we did do some events, but they weren't town hall or candidate forum events. I think I'll leave it. I think that's it.
So Courtney, I wanted to mention really quickly, I know we're running up against
Okay.
time, but in the candidate forum most recently in the city of Los Angeles for mayor, we invited all of the candidates, but of course only a handful of candidates attended. But it is important to get them on the record. And the thing that we pressed probably most vigorously is the single source of funding for affordable housing production. And it's such a challenge for our developers to get 3, 4, 5, 6 sources of funding. And that has been one of the candidates who actually attended became mayor, and that person is Karen Bass. And so we know that is on her radar, and she's hiring people that understand what we're talking about in large part because of the candidate forum. And so it definitely has an impact.
Right, definitely. Great question for Morgan. How do local League of Women Voters chapters partner with other organizations, including housing and homelessness organizations, to register and mobilize voters? And do you have any tips for people in this room who might be looking to form those sorts of partnerships?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And so, we have, I probably should have said this before, but we have over 750 state and local affiliates across the 50 states plus DC. So we do have a lot of local chapters. And so our state and local chapters partner with a lot of organizations, including, housing and homeless organizations. And a lot of those are to provide, direct voter registration, voter engagement activities, and that is in partnership as well as, tabling, presentations, showing up to, events like town halls or, conferences or, events that, community members may be at. And so, our local and state partners also, do train people, especially in housing organizations, to maybe register their neighbors and provide other education opportunities for public knowledge. And so the national office actually did partner with a housing organization that serviced people with limited incomes in 2018, and that organization had properties across the state. So in key communities, local chapters worked with their property to organize events, tabling events, voter registration and engagement events directly with residents. So those are kind of some of the ways that the League of Women Voters local chapters partner with organizations. And so one of the ways that you can form those relationships, of course, I think a lot of people have already said, is showing up at events where residents are present, and so just keeping those ties. But something that I also heard in Courtney's introduction was maybe capacity as a limitation. So also connecting with local organizations like League of Women Voters to help bridge that gap. A lot of local chapters have a long-standing relationship, as well as a lot of education and information on elections, and can provide that direct assistance. So thinking about other organizations that you may be able to work with to kind of combat that capacity issue too.
Thank you. I know one of our Housing Providers Council members in Madison, Wisconsin, had never done voter engagement before. I gave a little bit of a plug for the Housing Providers Council at a totally unrelated presentation. They ended up getting a grant from National Voter Registration Day, putting on a drive at a community event with League of Women Voters. They had bilingual voter registration and registered some new citizens who voted for the first time. So I've definitely seen examples of that success within our own network too. Question for Lisa. MICA is a statewide organization. I know you have many direct service providers in your network. Can you talk a little bit about how you brought election-related resources and information to those partners in 2022? What was successful, and what lessons you learned that will inform your future planning?
Sure. So I think a lot of it is we didn't have direct access to tenants, or so we tried to focus on tools that we could give to our partners in local communities that were either in the homeless response system or housing providers, on how they could work with folks. For example, like signing leases, how you can ask people and have them register to vote. Our interns created like QR codes for our absentee ballot and for voter registration form to make it easy. We did a few events, but we really tried to focus on, demystifying voting. One of the things that I learned was that I don't know that I wouldn't say it's apathy, but just a lack of maybe paying attention, and people, pay attention when it gets closer to the election. So really trying to focus on, the dates and the process, and how how voting has changed since the pandemic, and, absentee ballot for no reason. And now we have early voting in Michigan as of last year. Just a lot of different things just to, dispel kind of myths and provide information. And also focusing on voting as a racial justice issue. Some of the marginalized populations that have a harder time voting, materials in different languages, even just voting for people that are returning citizens, voting for people that, have visual impairments. All those different aspects are things that we tried to focus on. And then we used every method. I've talked about this before, like all different social media, our website. Every time we did a webinar or anything in public, we got a swag item. We had pens that we handed out that said, our homes, our votes, and my vote is important, so that, the tide of, actually voting, even though it's not really with a pen, but we put an ad in our conference, our housing conference booklet last year. I think that, we learned that, I learned not to do our surveys before the primaries. Focus really on, on who knows when our primary is going to be, but just, the time from our primary to the election, really doing a lot of planning and a lot more engagement with people that are serving people in housing and in the homeless response system to try and really get those people out. And just keeping the focus on the message, the importance of voting and why it matters. And then get great interns. One of the things that I was lucky, our interns were only around for the summer, but one of mine graduated, so he stayed until after the election. That was super important. Just to follow up on the candidate surveys was a huge thing. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Yeah, the follow-up is always really key to seeing that sort of transformation, having those regular meetings. I think that really shows the potential of engaging during election season and then turning that into something permanent. Relatedly, question for Chris. I know that SCANF was a leader in the campaign for Measure ULA, which is a ballot initiative that creates a permanent funding stream for deeply targeted investments in housing and homelessness prevention in LA. Could you talk a little bit about that campaign, tips for other organizations that are working on advocating for ballot measures in their communities?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say step one is start early. Start really, really early. So I think it's good that we are here in 2023 and we're already rolling. And I think that this is part of why the Our Homes, Our Votes Coalition was put together, because so many of our organizations, we've already talked about the short staffing, we've already talked about limited capacity, but if you have a slow trickle, even in off years, that keeps things at the top of mind, it's very important. So making sure that you have those regular conversations so you're not just showing up and knocking on people's doors when you need a vote or you need support or you need mobilization or you need numbers. You actually need to have real relationships with people. And that's going to make a huge, huge difference when you actually start going out and needing signatures. So we couldn't get anyone on our city council to carry the ballot Measure ULA. So we're not in a campaign mode anymore, so I don't know, I'll whisper it first, but we decided to tax the rich, tax the rich, tax the rich. So we didn't say that during the campaign, by the way, but we thought that it was a good idea, and so it was a 4.5% transfer on properties over $5 million, and that went to 5.5% on properties over $10 million. 97% of the sales in the city of Los Angeles would be completely unimpacted by this. But of course, we have the apartment association, the building owners and managers, all the people that have the best interests of tenants at heart, telling them what a terrible idea that this ballot measure was. But we had the relationships with the people. And so all of that money that came at the very end, when Lisa was talking about people really start paying attention at the end of the election cycle. And so that's what the big money was betting on. People are only going to pay attention for these final 3 weeks, and they're not going to have any clue once these, $5 million hit. We're just going to saturate the LA market and we're going to win. And we were really nervous on our campaign. We thought that when we were calling all summer, we gathered over 98,000 signatures from residents to put this on the ballot because we couldn't get any one of the individual council members to carry it. Mm-hmm. So we went and SCANF gathered over 1,000 signatures. But what we did is we worked not just with the affordable housing developers. We have a program that I am the regional convener for, but I don't know if we have some residents that are part of the group called the Residents United Network, but you guys will probably hear from Zella Knight a little bit later on in the policy forum. She's our president. And we also have Emily Martinique, who is here. I'm not sure if she's in the room, but she's here this morning. She's a member of the Residents United Network. We work with people who live in affordable housing and lift up their voices. And we partnered with them to go door to door and speak to their neighbors about the ballot initiative and get their signature. And once we qualified for the ballot, we came back and said, okay, we got your signature, we're on the ballot, you're about to receive a huge influx of mailers in your mailbox, all these things on TV telling you what a terrible idea that was that you signed, but you should vote yes on this. And so we were nervous, we thought we might not win. We won with almost 20% of the vote, 57%. We were stunned. We did not think that was going to happen. So it was really exciting to show that coalition building actually works. But raising money was a huge barrier because the opposition, of course, has got deep pockets and we don't. And so we have to make it up in sweat equity. So that means doing a lot of door knocking, giving up a lot of weekends and nights and all that kind of stuff. Not every night and not every weekend, but you got to get out there when people are home. No one's going to be home at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, right? Very few people are home at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So you want to make sure that you are getting out there. So this is, okay, I told you I was going to give you some stats. Here's the stats part. Okay, so we went to a location, Pizza Village. It's a Works property in the city of Los Angeles. We did a huge voter mobilization. I think there was 6 languages in the room. So we had a couple of different translators. We couldn't do it, every language, but we had the handout in 6 different languages, and that was going on in Spanish and English. And so there was a little delay, and it's a bit awkward. I give the delivery, and then there's a little delay, and then there's questions primarily coming in Spanish. But that property had 100% voter turnout. Over 100 of those residents were there.
It's amazing.
We couldn't believe it when we looked at the data. I said, okay, maybe we'll get half of those people to vote, and 100%. Another property, Little Tokyo Service Center in downtown Los Angeles, 7 properties that we went to, over 80% of those folks turned out to vote. And you saw the stats that Courtney showed earlier. Those numbers are not 80%. They're not 100% usually. So giving that little extra added boost, showing up at those properties, letting folks know. 73% of Hollywood community housing properties that we went to showed up and turned out to vote. Hollywood is a huge driver for the issues that we care about, so that was really important. And Abode Communities, one of the properties we went to, 70%. So we are just looking very preliminarily at the numbers, and we're seeing it makes a massive difference.
That's incredible. Congratulations. One final question for Morgan. So I know the League of Women Voters has a 501c3 and a 501c4 branch. Most of the people in this room, organizations are C3s, but some have C4s and some have considered starting C4s as well. Could you talk a little bit about the difference between C3 and C4 strategies and how these two branches can work together in coalitions effectively?
Sure. And I don't know how I'm going to follow up those stats, but I want to first start by saying I am not a lawyer. And so, if you do have, questions, this is a very, complex issue. So, it is best to seek counsel. But I could talk a little bit about our organization. So we do have both a C3 and a C4. And so our organization decided a long time ago that we wouldn't do any lobbying out of our C3. And so we do all of our voter registration, voter education, voter engagement out of our C3, and then lobbying out of our C4. So, there are, are a lot of things you can do with 501c3s, but there are limitations, including, making sure everything is nonpartisan, as well as, how much money you can spend lobbying. And so, if you are, doing ballot initiatives, it may be something to look into a 501c4 because how much direct lobbying you're doing, the money can start to add up. So, that's just kind of a little bit about our organization structure. But again, it's always, best to kind of seek legal counsel about, the 501c3 versus 501c4 and, how best it is and best it'll serve your organization. I do know that, both our 501c3 and 501c4 our activities are nonpartisan for both.
Thank you. I think we have time for probably just one audience question before we move into the panel. I see Anne's hand up there.
My question was, how do you fund your C4?
Good question.
Okay.
Good question. So I would probably not be the appropriate person to answer that. So, we do have a development department that works on, funding. So I don't have a great answer for you for that question.
Okay, maybe we have time for one more question if there's anything burning out there. I think I saw Elena's hand over there.
Thank you, guys. First of all, this was amazing information. One of the things that I just wondered, and I guess it's more of a technical question, because I was hearing you talking about, Lisa, about trying to get your particular surveys filled out, and then saying there are many groups that send out these surveys. Are there ways, and I'm wondering if League of Women Voters has any experience of this, of partnering with larger organizations that all, getting a couple really good housing questions on League of Women Voters, for example, survey? I was just curious if you all are familiar with that happening, or have any experience.
I don't know. We did connect with our Michigan League of Women Voters. I think it's a great idea, because who wants to fill out 100 surveys? So it's something to look into, and now's the time. We all know that planning now is going to bear a lot of fruit next year, and even for whatever's on the ballot this year. So it's something I know. We have a nonprofit. It's called Bridge Michigan, a nonprofit kind of news source. They have amazing information about the election, and I could see myself partnering and reaching out to them and saying, hey, can you ask a couple housing related questions and homelessness response questions, and I'm sure they would. So it's something to think about for sure, because it takes a lot of bandwidth.
Yeah, and I would say the same thing. Just asking the question and seeing, what the pros and cons are, and if there's a way to kind of lift that issue, especially if it's a very important issue in your community.
Okay.
So I wanted to mention something. This doesn't relate to the question at all. I'm sorry. I when I went to some of these resident meetings, I mentioned Dr. Bambi Brown from Georgia, because in the cohort that we were part of, we heard back from partners like you all what was going on across the country. And I was stunned to hear what was going on in Georgia. People were being threatened in line while they were voting with guns. I mean, they weren't even able to bring food out to folks. I mean, what is going on in this country? And so understanding what's going on out there and saying, hey, we can vote by mail in Los Angeles. It is really, really easy. 100% of the people are receiving their votes by mail. All you got to do is fill it out. And most people just say, well, I don't even know. That thing is so long. I have no idea what's Measure ULA. And so just getting in people's ear, that's a huge advantage. Just making that touch.
Thank you. All right, let's give a big round of applause to all of our panelists. I know I learned a lot, but this is not the end of the Our Homes, Our Votes program. We're actually now going to move into breakouts, and so we have a handful of breakout facilitators. Could you all raise your hands if you're a breakout facilitator? Everyone up here is one. So if we could ask our facilitators to spread out among tables, try to fill each of the tables evenly, and there will be a bit of a brainstorming worksheet. Also, Rachel, could Rachel raise her hand? Rachel's table is going to be kind of geared towards people who want to talk a little bit more about C4 engagement. So if you have a C4 or want to learn more about C4s, Rachel's table is the place to go. But yeah, we will spread out and join a table.
Yeah. All right.
Oh, yes.
There are handouts at each of the tables for each partner to take to help with this activity.
Yes, if that's okay.
Yeah,
All right, welcome back. We've got one more exciting session as part of the convening. So go ahead and grab a seat. Before we jump into the panel and topic, I do know that we've had a few more folks join on Zoom and a couple that are part of the racial equity cohort. So if they're available, we just want to give them a chance to say a quick hello, introduce themselves, and we'll see if we can pull them up.
Yay, Peter!
Hello, Peter. We see you on the big screen.
Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm Peter Fowler, the Equity and Training Coordinator with the Coalition on Homelessness and Housing in Ohio, or COHIO. I'm located here in Columbus, Ohio. It's good to be with you all today.
Thank you so much for joining and for participating in the cohort. Anyone else?
Hey, good morning, everybody. Forgive my background. I don't know why I sound like that, but Eric McLaughlin, Housing Louisiana, part of the Put Housing First Triad out of New Orleans with Housing New Orleans and Greater New Orleans Housing Alliance. Great to be here with everybody.
Thanks for being back with us again. Anyone else? Okay, we'll go ahead and kick it over to Brooke.
All right, thanks, Lindsay. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you again today for day 2. So this is our last panel of the State and Tribal Partner convening, and before we jump into forum this afternoon. But we've got a really great discussion for you all to wrap things up. So I'm first going to do a quick overview of how our State and Tribal Partner racial equity cohort came to be, and then jump into our lovely panelists who are really the stars of the show here. So many of you know are familiar with our IDEAS work, which stands for Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, Anti-Racism, and Systems Thinking. I had a little cheat sheet because I need that. Renee Willis, our SVP for Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, she led our spring convening last year, which was virtual and focused on racial equity, and kind of jumped in, did an overview of ideas and got a baseline. We jumped into the different breakout sessions and got a baseline for how you all, our state and tribal partners, are addressing racial equity in your own work, and what are the gaps and challenges that you're facing, what are the successes you've had. And then Renee and the field team got together, discussed some ways that we might be able to support state and tribal partners in this work moving forward. And last September, we launched our first racial equity cohort of state and tribal partners with 16 organizations who are already had some traction and capacity to be doing this work, because this is an unfortunately unfunded cohort. But our goal is to partner with this group of people to learn what's working, what's not, kind of build out what could be helpful to the rest of the network of state and tribal partners to advance racial equity in our work. So we've held 6 meetings together so far, including an extended hybrid meeting, work session during the fall convening in November. And we've invited many cohort members to give quick updates during our monthly state and tribal partner calls, and we'll continue meeting through June. Then we hope to launch a new cohort in the fall and kind of expand this work. So stay tuned for more on that. And today we have 2 wonderful organizations, 3 people, to share from highlights of their racial equity cohort. So I'll just go down the line here. We have Jay Williams from Low Income Housing Coalition of Alabama, Melvin Henley from Community Economic Development Association of Michigan, and Elena Hampton Stover, also from Low Income Housing Coalition of Alabama. So thank you all for being with us today and for all the great work that you've been doing with the racial equity cohort. So let's just jump right in. And first question to get things started, what are some creative and or impactful ways that your organization or coalition is intentionally centering racial equity in your work? Jay, let's start with you.
Thank you, Brooke. Last panel, no pressure. So at Collaborative Solutions and at Leica, we start internally. I think that that's probably the biggest step that you can make in terms of implementing racial equity into your work. We've hosted some co-learning spaces for our staff at Collaborative Solutions to share their ideas about how they can best be seen and how that can best be implemented into the policy changes that are happening at Collaborative Solutions, so that that can then snowball into the effects of our work with persons with lived experience and expertise of housing and homelessness and instability. Essentially, that means we're co-creating our internal structures so that our staff, like me, can go out and learn how to co-create systems and events with individuals of lived experience and homelessness. I think that that's probably one of the most innovative ways that we've done this, because it's been highly intentional with the message that this is supposed to impact your work outside of the organization. And yeah, that's where I'll start.
Great. Anything to add, Elena? And then we'll go to Melvin. And yeah,
that makes sense. I feel that. Yeah, I think that for me, so Jay and I have somewhat different roles in our organization, and part of my role is engaging pretty deeply with our board at the Low Income Housing Coalition of Alabama. And so we have put a lot of effort in building the capacity and the understanding of our board in why we are doing equity work, why we are talking about race equity in particular, and how that intersects with things like engaging those with lived experience of housing instability and homelessness. And I think it's just really important to consider the different contexts that we are all coming from, right? And so really being able to assess what is the context around your organization, what may people be up against. I think we assumed goodwill from the jump in working with our board, that we know that these are folks who care, a lot of them coming from historically marginalized populations themselves, and want to have equitable outcomes for people, also are up against a lot in their own funding sources, in state dynamics and fear around what does this mean if this organization where I'm sitting on the board is coming out and being like race equity, this is, in a state that's like CRT, no. These are really important considerations. So it was starting where they were and being able to walk along that journey with folks to say, what would be the meaningful next steps in front of us? We build this sense that it is our ethical and moral obligation to advance this work, to advance race equity. So now, what are the next steps forward? What are the things you can do? What are the things that are within your power? Just trying to make something feel more possible and accessible, and that it doesn't have to be the end goal tomorrow, that we're talking really about a journey. And so steps forward are significant and matter, and being able to celebrate the small things that happen. Who was it? Somebody was saying making mountains out of molehills in the yesterday in those. Yes, thank you, Andrew. I'm going to take that and live with that. So yeah, that sticks out to me, is just being able to celebrate the small successes and starting where people are and thinking about what does it take to advance to the next step.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I'm going to respond to it slightly different. This is a little bit of audience participation, if we can, I know. All right, so question number one is, raise your hand if your organization is involved with diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Perfect. All right, you can put your hand down. How many of you would say that your organization is centering diversity, equity, and inclusion work? Have a look around the room. There's a difference in the amount of organizations that are involved with this work and the organizations that are centering this work. And so I think, when you look at this question and you reflect on it, like, what does centering mean? Like, how do you engage with something that may have been on the outskirts and you bring it to the center, that is a part of the initial, that's the conversation starter, right? And so when the question is like, how did your organization begin to center it? Like, we had to do a self-assessment to say, like, how are we engaging in this? is it off center? Are we left center? Are we like not even, on the space? And so being able to unpack even that question and understanding where we truly are was a starting point for us in the work that we're doing over at CEDAM. And I think, once we came to the realization that we quite weren't where we wanted to be, then we started to create tasks, started to figure out how can we get better? What does getting better look like? So one of the things that we did is, we created an action plan, and we can talk a little bit about that later, all of these different steps, but we also asked our members. We're a coalition organization. We have 300 members across the state, but we really wanted to know, what are other folks doing? Where are they being successful in this work before we just get to doing, because that's easy for a lot of people to do. And so we were able to receive some really fantastic input from our members, folks that have tried and other things to understand, what's going on, what's lessons learned. And I think for some, that was a very unique and creative approach because they hadn't been asked what they're doing and how they've been successful in this work. So being able to just pause and just say, you tell me, you're a leader in this space, you are an expert in this engagement, and inform us. So people responded really well to just that question. And that one question led to emails, coffees, a 4-hour conversation, so many things that people were willing to share. So I would say that's one thing about how it's being centered. And then, as we started to have different interactions and different pieces, beginning to share that with other folks, and that becomes impactful because not only are you receiving it, you're able to share with other folks to say, this is how you can change, whether it's your hiring practices, your board engagement, your, working with your members, doing your own coalitions, and being able to, whether it's trainings, whether it's a guide or a FAQ, or even how you talk about these things, and not just holding the information. I think, us as organizations, we can say, we're doing this one thing, this is what our unique selling point, but you don't share with other people. But I think this work is so important that you should be sharing it with other folks. You should be going to the top of the mountaintops and screaming down about this is what's going on and this is how you can learn and grow from it. So I think there's some quick examples.
I'd love to just respond to a couple of things that Melvin said, because two things really stick out to me. One is toward the tail end of what you said around this idea of the spirit of sharing and giving. One thing, I have a mentor, mama, sister person in my life, Dr. Jerry Peak, and she mentioned to me this idea of collective abundance and really being mindful about, in a space where we consider scarcity of resources so often, trying to lead with a spirit of collective abundance. And I think that sharing resources, sharing what we are learning, that's one of the best things that we can be doing. And I guess this kind of relates to the other thing that stood out to me is starting out, even just modeling here today, starting out with questions. Shows a degree of humility that I think is incredibly important in this work as well. One of the things that I had to get comfortable with, and I would imagine that other people struggle with this, imposter syndrome, anybody ever? And just feeling like I don't need to wait to be an expert to start doing. And you don't either. So being able to lead with humility is very powerful because I think it shows to other people, I don't consider myself an expert in this work. I'm learning just like everyone else is, and I'm inviting you along in that journey, that's all. And I think that just really, to me, in terms of the spirit, we can talk about these things of what does success look like, but I think the spirit in which we carry out this work is equally important.
Just a quick piggyback. Just reflecting on the way that the question was phrased, something that's creative and impactful. I think that when we're talking about creative and impactful, it really just start with just doing the work. You can't really think about how can I put together a special group for this? How can I put together a, just build a new structure for this. The structure already exists. It exists across several different communities that we all serve. We've learned you have to just learn how to listen. And I think that's the ultimate way that we can really begin doing the work is starting with listening to other folks and how we can implement their ideas for how they think that they can best be served.
Wow, I heard a lot there and was like, oh yeah, we're going to go to more questions, but I feel like we could just sit on this topic for a long time. But my next question is about successes and how you're measuring progress. And I think I already heard several successes about, listening, asking those questions internally and externally, leading with humility. Those are all successes to me, but I think what we've landed on several times or hit several times in our racial equity cohort is how do we measure success? How do we show that we're doing this work and doing it well? So if you all could touch on that, I'll start with Melvin.
Yeah, measuring success is so hard. And especially when it comes to this work, because there's no medals or certifications or, pats on the back to be like, yeah, you did good. But one of the things, but I think it does come through in the work. So one of the examples I was talking about when sharing with others is we have engaged in hiring, how to be more inclusive in your hiring practices. So before, we did some looks at other organizations and did some trainings, and you were like, all right, that sounds good over there, but what does it mean for us? And so last summer we were hiring for 3 new positions, and so we really dug into where are we recruiting from? What is the actual work that what needs a degree, what doesn't need a degree, what is other experience that we can honor, how are we reflecting on community experience, community organizing, other community involvement, and its importance in the work that we're doing. So, and I think with these 3 new positions that were filled, we achieved the goals in terms of diversity in a number of different places, being able to understand what our values being reflected in the folks that we were bringing on, and being able to be really proud of a process that was different than what we had done before. Was it perfect? No, but it was something that was leading us in the right direction. And then I would say another thing that was a success was when it came to our board. We just did some board recruitment, or in the midst of doing board recruitment. Again, there were some changes and stuff that was offered up through this work, and one of the questions that was a part of the board application process was about what does diversity, equity, and inclusion mean to you? It wasn't we want folks to have a sense of the question, and I don't want to say negative points, is you want to have a baseline understanding. And we had an internal conversation about if that's something that should be there, but then also landing that, yes, this was important to our organization, important to the staff, important to other board members, that we're going to move forward. And so I think not only ticking that box, but being able to be confident in the response and the explanation about why that was included, because we did receive questions from folks about why is this there? And so I think it was deemed a success when you can stand on something and be these are our values, and this is why this question is there, because it's important to us and X, Y, and Z, and not feel bad about it, but being able to stand on it and hold your head high. And so I would hold those up as a few examples, but would love to hear from my other folks.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. One of the things that stands out to me in a nerd space, I'm very interested in, not that this is not also a nerd space, let's be real, but in another nerd space in my life, I'm very interested in liberatory evaluation practices and thinking about what are all the ways of knowing. What are all the ways that historically many people have known things and lost that knowledge and are now reclaiming that knowledge, right? So the thing that just makes me think a lot when we ask about these ideas about measuring progress and just being mindful about what are all the ways that we can know and how are we including all of those different ways in how we measure progress. So one of the things that stands out to me a lot in progress and success is relationship. I professionally identify as a social worker. I very strongly feel that identity, and I think that professional orientation really says that everything comes back to relationship. It doesn't matter if it's micro therapeutic practice, meso family, community level practice, or policy practice. That these things, and I see heads nodding like, yes, policy comes down to relationships. We know this in our work. And so to me, some of the successes that we have had and the things that I would celebrate the most have been the new relationships that we have built, the relationships that we have strengthened, and really showing. So one of the things that we took on this year was a roadshow, so to speak, of doing some listening sessions across the state and being really intentional about where we chose those listening sessions and making sure, for example, a listening session was in the Black Belt, and even deeper into that, we were like, this has got to be in Selma. We were just like, just the historical significance of this and that sense of, you know, this community has done things for the nation, for the world that matter, and we want to honor that, and we want to show up with humility. And it's been so interesting to see when you have that willingness to say, we're coming to you. You know, would somebody be willing to host us? Who could we partner with? How much has come into play easily of people really being willing to leverage their own relationships to say, oh, you know, I mean, just the other day we had a meeting that was almost impromptu with a different housing authority with their COO, and he was like, y'all connected to the Selma Housing Authority? Like, I got you. Like, they're gonna get something, and let them know you know, I'm sending you, and I trust you, you know, pretty much. And so to me, it's really, that's been the biggest area of progress and success, is feeling that sense of forged relationships and people seeing intention and you know, really being willing to put themselves out there for you and leverage their relationships for you, which to me, that's a sign you're doing something right.
I think people are going to tell you whether or not you're successful at this. I mean, whether there may not be an award or some kind of certification for it, people are going to tell you if they feel seen, heard, understood, and empathized with. And at the end of the day, that's what this work is about, right? Like you're trying to create a space for folks to be seen, heard, validated, and to create the world that they want to see. And at Collaborative Solutions and at Leica, I think that we've really done a good job of allowing people to feel heard, when so often across history that has not been the case, especially in the housing space. Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty simply that. Like, people will tell you if they don't feel heard, and they won't work with you if they don't feel like that you authentically appreciate their collaboration with you and co-creation with you.
Yeah. So one of the things I always like to do with the audience outside of audience participation is to provide some homework. And so I think this aspect of relationships is so important. And so I would challenge you all as organizations to assess, like, who do you have relationships with? Where is there alignment in terms of like values, like where it stands on race, like racial equity work and other things? Because not only is the relationships important, but then how you spend your resources. So if you are, it could be money in this case, like if you're part of other organizations, but also how are you spending your time? Are you showing up to meetings and stuff and like the connection isn't there, the alignment isn't there? Are you a part of coalitions where like, you know, they talk about one thing, but it's not being delivered? I know with our cohort, I question in LIHC about like if you're having a DEI an ideas cohort, like you're not just going to take from us, but what does this mean to your organization? Like, what are you all doing? And I've had conversations with Renee and Lindsay and others, Brooke, and others as well about like, what does this mean for you all as well? Because you're not just going to take from us, like it needs to be a mutually beneficial relationship there. So like, I think that's something that I think you all can take back and kind of assess like, oh, is there some coalition meetings that I'm going to where it's not hitting the mark, or other things that you're a part of, et cetera. So.
Can I just, in the homework space, there is a really amazing article from a consultant that I've had the opportunity to work with, who's connected to Caminar Latino, which is out of the Atlanta area. But the article is called Transformational Collaboration. I can share it out with folks because it is publicly available, but it really encourages folks to rethink what collaboration looks like, and who is at the decision-making table and when, and what part are different people playing when it comes to collaboration, and really moving beyond and even not just tokenization, but even like moving beyond, we're paying this consultant and then we're getting to use their stuff that they authored and change it in whatever way we want in perpetuity forever. You know, these all, who really owns things, and how do those things come about? And I think it asks some just very good questions for you to be thinking about when you do start to partner with folks. What does it mean to collaborate, and how do we build transformational collaboration?
I just want to speak to this as a person that does not oversee somebody, as a staff person that has a supervisor, right? First and foremost, it's the commitment to coming back to the work that shows success in my eyes. It's the readiness to say, okay, so we started here, we're going to go here next, and follow through with that promise. And that is where I find that I see the success stories, because it's the commitment to remaining diligent and steady and intentional.
Yeah, thank you. In terms of NLHC, it's been so powerful for us to hear these ideas and these challenges and look inwardly ourselves, like Melvin said. And so the field team earlier this year got together and looked at who are our relationships, who's in our network, since we're the first point of contact. And that's like one tiny step, but we had never done that before, of looking who is in our network, how diverse is it, and how can what are the intentional steps we can take to building more relationships? And yeah, just hearing more from folks and getting who are directly impacted. I think that's come up time and time again in this cohort, is that intersection between people with lived experience and expertise and this DEI work, diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and how we make sure that everyone has an equal seat at the table. And so, you know, we've talked a lot about successes. We've also touched on some challenges, but I'd like us to dive a little deeper in some challenges. You know, what are the biggest challenges you face in achieving your goals? I've heard some, one thing today in the cohort, like balancing that big picture thinking of what it actually means to achieve racial equity and achieving those small molehills of bringing people along, like balancing that, running with the people who are already alongside you, and then bringing folks along to build your coalition as one challenge, but would love to hear either expanding on that or other challenges that you guys face and want to share about. Lena?
Yeah, one of the big challenges that I think came up in the cohort a lot, especially early on, that I strongly relate to, is the tendency of particularly white people to want to intellectualize these issues and say, what can I do about this? Let's start a book club. Like, oh my God, the number of book clubs in 2020 was like massive, right? All of a sudden, everybody wanted their book club. And I thought about this a lot, and Jay knows, God, Jay's had to hear my rants about white people book clubs on race. But one of the things that I thought about was like, why does this feel like the thing? Why does this feel like the step? And it does seem as though it's comfortable, and the consuming of the information and intellectualizing that is fundamentally different than applying that. So it often stops at what does this mean for me? What is the constructive application to the work that we are doing? So that's a struggle, that remains a struggle. And that is hard at an individual level. It is infinitely harder at a group level, much less a coalition of organization level, to think about how do you coalesce around the practical application of the things that you're learning. And often the things that we're learning, it does feel so overwhelming that you think about how can we even take a step? How would we even start to, chunk this out into ways of moving from where we are now, from where we have historically been, to things that would increase equity? So, I appreciate that. And can you give me a little more words to that? An example of what of the practical application? Yeah. So to me, one thing that we did in Alabama was we took a look at, and this is more easily accessible in our area, but I think exists for everyone. What is the historical context in our area? Like, it's not saying the knowledge part is bad. It's an important part of the process. But what is the historical context? How does that play into who our partners are today, where funds are distributed today, who's on our board today? And that goes beyond just race, because that's about, there may be an upper middle class Black woman in Huntsville who's on our board, just one example, but not somebody from the Black Belt who is living in public housing, as another example, right? And so we really intentionally said, okay, where do we need to double down our efforts to put focus in specific areas? So where is our programming showing up? Where are we going out to? It's far less convenient for Jay to go hold a listening session in Selma than it is for us to go down to the Capitol in Montgomery, even, much less in our own offices in Birmingham, where we don't have to worry about a location, right? But we're saying, okay, we're going to take the extra steps, even if we don't have money to reserve a room. We're going to call up the local library. We're going to figure out who are our new partners in this area. And it's the commitment to make it happen, saying we will be here. We will expand to Dothan Housing Authority next year. Like, it's building a plan from where we are and chunking out. Next year, these are our priorities. The year after that, these are our priorities, and taking each step down the line.
Yeah, so I think, kind of just going off of what Elena said, I think the biggest challenge is your next step. You can always start, right? There's always, like, we have the conversation internally. We've like, oh, this is what race equity is. This is what the implementation may look like. But it's your next step. Where is the follow-up happening? Is it the intentional effort to find that additional partner? Is it the assessment? Is it the long conversation with a pastor who has more information about that community than you ever could? Where is that next step coming in? And I think that's with race equity, where because this journey is so far and so long, and it has to overcome so much, that next step is always your greatest challenge.
Yeah. And I just appreciate these beautiful minds up here, because so many things they've mentioned are stuff I just read, I wrote down. I think being able challenges. So being able to if you go back to your first, second grade, when you start to learn early literary tools, think about like the who, what, when, where, how, and why. Being able to understand the why behind something is such a challenge. Being able to understand the how you're going to get there is such a challenge. Being able to capture those in words that make sense is an even greater challenge. Beyond the it feels right or we need to do this, but being able to say, like, if you're defining a better future, what does that better future look like? If you're going to center, something, if you're going to center racial equity, what does that look like? And then being able to talk about the how. And people struggle with that. Being able to capture those things that are out here or feel good or it's just in your heart or just the type of person I am, but being able to capture that on paper, I think is hard. And so we have looked at many of folks, and we continue to look at folks to understand if there's a simpler way or much more straightforward way. So that continues to be a challenge. I would say the timeline of this work and being able to sell it to like your supervisor, sell it to the board, sell it to your partners to say like, this isn't something that's gonna happen overnight. We didn't get into this problem yesterday, but there's so many things that are at the table and need to be considered for it to be done in a meaningful way. But it said not to back away from that challenge, but take it like head on. And I think that's an example to say like, this is gonna be an ongoing commitment, but how can we get better each and every day at it? And then I would say another challenge of it is being able to see not only internally, but then also externally, is for other people to see themselves in this work. It isn't just that our organization is responsible for it. It's like, no, like every person at our organization, from the finance person to the ED, plays a role in us advancing this work. And then when it comes to externally, our partners and other folks, like they play a role in this. And for other people to see themselves in it can be a challenge because some folks just don't engage with it, or that's a big city problem, that's a rural problem. Or they can come up with some excuse, but being able to convey that the problems that we're addressing, the issues that we're addressing, require effort from everyone. And that it's something that happens collaboratively, as we said before. So being able to really be straightforward and kind of have those responses to those questions and being able to stand on them and have everyone believe in the reason why they're there and their contribution.
Yeah, and I really appreciate this discussion around both Tara, who asked, like, what gives some examples, and the panel here talking both today and when we were prepping for this discussion is like, let's stop talking about the issues and like, what are we actually going to do about them? What's one thing I can do when I go home? And what do I actually have control over in my organization based on what my role is, where I am in the hierarchy. And so that's what we're going to be doing actually for the last piece of our convening, is having more table discussions and some reflection time to take one actual next step that you are going to go home with. And then at our next monthly meeting, I'm scared to say this because then maybe people won't show up, but we're going to ask how that went. And, it's fine to be honest and be like, we haven't gotten to it yet, but this is what our plan is for putting it into action. So, that accountability with each other and in doing this together. And like Alina said, the humility, leading with humility in this. And so before we jump into those table discussions, kind of along those lines, just want to have the panelists talk about how participating in the racial equity cohort has been helpful for you, and what do you see as possible next steps for this or future cohorts? Melvin, do you want to jump in?
Actually, can I?
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
still
you
processing.
can, yeah.
If one of you would like to.
Yeah, I'm happy to briefly just say one thing that actually I hope we start within this space is, and that we had talked about, was really looking at, okay, how do you start to, one way of thinking about practical next steps is thinking about what's a lane, what's one area that we really want to focus on. We can come up against capacity issues a lot because we are a small organization. So how do we say, okay, we're really going to focus on authentically engaging people with lived experience, and what is that intersection with race equity? And so thinking about future cohorts being able to have, in the same way we have with like the Erase cohort, a couple of tracks, where you can say, we really specifically want to hear about this area of measuring success in DEI work, and this part of the cohort is really gonna focus in on that. And I feel like for me, what I've gained is relationships. That's the most powerful thing that I personally have gained, and I think that bolsters your capacity to do the work, learning from others, but also just being able to have more resources, people who to commiserate with, all of those pieces are really important in the sustainability for our own selves to keep moving forward.
So I think this work can often be very isolating. I think that if you're the sole entity in your state that's pushing race equity, especially in housing, it can be very isolating. And the race equity cohort really does a great job of building your capacity for feeling not so isolated while you do this work. I think that because race equity is so diverse in how we are interacting with based off of the people that we have to interact, whether it be with tribal groups, whether it be with Black families, whether it be with like Latino or Hispanic individuals. I think that it really does just lend toward the strength that you need to keep the work moving forward.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I appreciate that, like, especially with this group, is that partner is a word that is lifted up, and being able to really lean into it. I'm not sure about your dating experience, but I know that people define partners like differently across like and like what that looks like. But I'm just saying, like, I know at least with this group, when it comes to partners, that people really lean into that, and being able to share resources, being able to have those conversations, but being able to like go into a space where, you know, people are trying to support you and want your organization to be the best that it can be. So I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate. And then when it comes to the ideas, I think it's like being able to connect with folks who have been doing this for various lengths of time, and understanding like what's worked, what hasn't worked, what can be better, but then also realizing that like this is an ongoing process. So like to just know that people are continuing to chip away at it, no matter the speed, but like we're getting there. Like we're working for a better tomorrow. As cliche as that sounds, like work continues to happen. And I think it's like being able to understand like what our organization can do, because we know other folks have already done it or are working towards it.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in as well. What NLHC, participating in the racial equity cohort, we're not just facilitating it; we're actively participating and getting feedback from, like, learning from our partners on how they're doing this work. And one example was the last meeting. I selfishly imposed a question of like, how do you measure diversity in your membership network? And because we want to measure that as one of our first steps of making sure that, you know, our network and the voices that we're like lifting up to members of Congress is actually diverse, and not just those people with privilege or, you know, are white, and can actually give diverse perspectives and share their stories on how different policies have impacted them. And so, we're sending out a membership survey sometime this year to get that baseline data. Surveys are hit and miss, but we're going to do our best. And then really kind of setting goals, number goals. It feels difficult, like kind of tricky with racial equity of like setting number goals and feeling tokenizing. But I feel like if we do that along with the like relationship building, the stuff that's not as quantitative, pairing those two together will be more successful. So setting goals for the number of tenants that we're bringing into our network, and expanding the number of voices that we're tapping for our tenant blog, different webinars and stuff like that, instead of continuing to tap the same people over and over and over again and burdening folks. So those are just a couple of examples of what we're, go ahead.
Just very quickly, just about data, and I'm hearing the persons in the back's question about like, give us more examples. One of the things that's so important is that folks are scared. My experiences show that people can be scared to ask the question, no matter what that question is, because they don't want to know the answer. And I'm sure people can reflect on their own examples there. But being able to not only ask a question, receive the information, and if it's data, being able to disaggregate the data. Because once you start to do that, you'll understand that the stories behind it can be so vastly different for different types of people. Whether you're looking at affordable housing and home ownership, you can go down the list about all of these different applications. But when you start to disaggregate the data, it tells a more vivid story for the groups that are represented inside of it. So if you don't disaggregate it, you're not telling a true story. But once you start to disaggregate it, like, you're able to say that no, Black and brown people struggle to get home ownership, or are, you know, evicted at a much higher rate than the larger data point that's there. And being able to share that data when you get into those conversations with funders or elected officials, or et cetera, to say this is what it is there. And I hope that in NLHC, when you were asking those questions, whether it's membership, you can see that like when it comes to organizations or organizers, that like you may be hitting the overall mark, but it may be lacking in other areas. So that's another example about being able to take that main story, but then break it down into pieces as well.
Absolutely. Those numbers are not just numbers, they build into the picture. Yeah, that's excellent. Thanks. We have time for like 1 or 2 questions, and then we'll jump into table discussions if anyone has any questions for this lovely panel. Anyone? No? Oh, we have a mic coming up because our folks on Zoom won't be able to hear you. Thank you, Mackenzie. Up here.
I have just a quick one about the cohort. So in the cohort, have you had just like coalition staff involved in that, or has there been like members of your boards also joining in with the cohort calls?
That's a great question. So we actually have all of the state and tribal partner caucus members as part of the cohort, as well as others that we kind of identified from that last spring meeting. So beyond the state and tribal partner caucus on the board, no, we haven't invited that broader, but there is some ideas work happening with the board members, but not as intense and intentional maybe as this monthly meeting. Yeah.
I meant in your monthly meetings with y'all's organization.
Oh, yeah, sorry, go
ahead. Your board's joining in with that as well.
So yeah, we have our annual board meeting at our annual conference. Every year, and so this past year that was where we jumped off and started doing our DEI work with them to really begin shaping and molding and developing that muscle for them to implement this work. For the conference, we actually went through a lot of efforts to host listening sessions with people of lived experience of housing instability and homelessness. And that was not something that had been done before to develop our conference. And so working with our board members to help them understand the why, and also why we were telling the story at the conference of our DEI efforts, that was the first step. And then we have our quarterly meetings. And so building in meetings with other individuals of lived experience into the board meetings, as well as like other programming that affects them to educate them more, so is next on our agenda to bring them up to speed more. So.
Yep, and I would say yes, we're in the middle of a strategic planning process. I can hear the collective groans as it relates to that. But I think one of the things that in our previous strategic plan that we did 3 or so years ago, we also had a diversity, equity, and inclusion plan as well. But they were separate pieces, and if you think of it as like a vertical that just sat on its own, but realizing that wasn't the best way, and we wanted to be a horizontal line that cuts across all of our work. And so one of the things, I think by way of not only staff, but also the external folks that are helping, we realized the importance of having our board be a part of that process and not having them be a standalone. So the fact that we have done collective training around different pieces of diversity, equity, inclusion, we've had deep dives into like, why is this work important? Like, what does it mean for us? Like, et cetera. And I think, and we've had cross engagement with the staff and the board, not separate conversations. And so like all of that has aided to us being in a better place as an organization and encourage folks to ask me questions or talk about that experience.
Thank you. Gina, did you have a question?
So when you were talking about measuring success, and maybe I missed it, but are you also looking at like trainings that you're doing and like with who and what groups and just internally, externally, what does that look like? And maybe that's a way to measure success as well, like who's getting the training and like are they graduating from that training? And I'm curious if you've ever tried doing training with your legislators on race equity.
Yeah, so we have not started that work yet, Gina. Maybe you can give us some tips on But I do think I'm like plug for the measuring success table if you want to continue this convo. I think that we have been focused on kind of what does our coalition look like just full transparency. That's kind of where we are right now, is who is reflected in our coalition. Where do we need to intentionally build or deepen relationships and invite folks in / go to people. And so that's kind of where we have been. And I think that the mobilization components of now that we kind of have a mind for this year, we are expanding outreach, going to folks, and then next year we're looking at consolidation of that and what does that look like and what is needed for that. So I appreciate those thoughts because I think that they'll be helpful in thinking about those pieces of, well, what support do people need to be meaningfully engaged in this work and stay a part of the coalition.
Yep, and I would say, yeah, again, I appreciate the question. And yes, when it comes to like measuring the success, when it comes to trainings, like we've looked at who's showing up, like we've had conversations about like paid versus not paid and like what access looks like. We've also had conversations about like if we give out awards, like how many white males have we given them to versus like other folks. So being able to have these different like areas of measurement versus both internally, things that we can control, and then externally, and being able to speak at the table. When it comes to our legislators, we haven't done a formal training because it's different speeds that we're working at. But I would say we have been successful in telling the story through data. So being able, and I would say along with support from other folks on our policy team, have been encouraged to say like, no, be in the meeting and call out those disparities when it comes to disaggregating the data. Because if you're talking about economic development and the impact of housing, you can talk about the spending power of folks, or you could talk about location or access to transportation and saying who has access and who doesn't have access. And people have been able to achieve greater reception in terms of saying it that way, as opposed to saying you should care about equity or you should care about diversity, because even diversity in and of itself is more more complex than just gender diversity, right? There's a lot of different nuances, and I would say not all elected officials have that level of sophistication, but can understand things. And I'm sure as a number of folks in the room, you have to adjust your message to suit your audience. So having enough tools in your back pocket so you can be at the ready for, all right, this is how you want to say it. I got something for you. There's one more question.
Oh, yep. Just really quickly, and then we're going to jump into table discussion.
Hi, how are you doing? So the question that she posed in the back, I know she's like, they keep going back to my question about the successes. But I think about in Kentucky, we had a huge issue with human trafficking. And it's always like a touchy thing. No one wants to talk about it. It's like icky. But when we faced it head on, and we talked to government officials, and we brought it to them and all the social service people, and we said, these are the issues, this is the data, but then also examples, then they were more swayed. So oftentimes people can see data, and they can say data numbers, but do you ever take the time when we talk about the successes of people that you all had, those group of people that come that had the lived experiences, and allow them to be a part of those conversations so they can see it, because media can paint affordable housing to be whatever they want it to be. Sure. But when you can see it in reality of what it really is and the benefit that it can do for people, if they are able to get that opportunity, then they will be more on board. So have you all ever thought about taking that opportunity of using the success stories and presenting those along with the data so that they can paint the picture as a whole?
Absolutely, and I appreciate you. When you're in the panel, I got to get so much in, and absolutely, storytelling 1,000% is so important. And yeah, you may have interactions with folks, but you're like, let me get out of the way so the folks who have these direct experiences can tell those stories. And people they respond to, they react to it. So yeah, 100%. And if you're gonna have participate in the Hill Day, or if you have your own legislative day where you or partner days where folks go to the Capitol and tell those stories. I know, shout out to Lisa in Michigan. Her organization does some really great work in terms of lifting up folks who have those experiences and getting them in front of places that they might not have access to. So yes, storytelling 1,000%.
Yeah. So let's move into table discussions. We could go on all day on this, I think, but I'll turn it to Lindsay to get us into tables.
Yeah, I'm just going to help orient everyone. So a number of key themes have been coming up in our racial equity cohort meetings, and so we've named those and put them on different tables, and we have a table. Actually, I'm going to have any of the racial equity cohort participants, or if you know your organization is participating, just raise your hands, because they've been doing many extra meetings and offering some really, really great resources and information. So thanks for participating. And I've asked many of them to be kind of a table lead. So now we're going to ask you to move to a table that you want to have a focused conversation about. And on your agenda today, you see the different themes. You can find them at the tables. And there's worksheets at the tables too to help you get thinking about what are your next steps, what are you committing to after the next half hour here, and the table leads can kind of move things along. So we're going to take about, we'll say 20 minutes, 25 minutes maybe in these small groups, and then we'll come back for some reflections. All right, everyone, we're going to come back as a group from our table discussions. If we can wind down the table discussions, we're going to come back for some reflections. Glad to hear so much conversation. So we're going to wrap up with just some basic reflections, what you've been talking about, and we've got some mic runners to help us catch everyone. So I'm just curious what common themes came up at your tables, if anybody wants to share what you've been chatting about.
A number of different conversations. I'll just leave off with the last conversation. So our table is focused on authentic engagement with people with lived experience and expertise. And I shared a little bit of my probably not so popular opinion, but I think we came to agreement and saw that. But essentially, recognizing and affirming folks' experience and expertise, but not having blind deference. We talked about, basically the African proverb of steel sharpening steel, and how we are disingenuous when we don't push back, when we don't engage in dialogue and have real conversations and deep relationships with people with lived experience as we plot, as we co-conspire on things, instead of sometimes folks are like, yeah, no, that's a great idea, and they have a meeting afterwards to change a whole strategy, right? And so and so what it means to really, push back, to engage in deep dialogue, to be uncomfortable, because that, when we tied it back to, that was our holding on to our right to comfort. And we have to let go. And what do we say? Challenge, embrace, and lean in, right? Into the discomfort, into the hard conversations. Because again, steel sharpens steel by helping folks to this is why that strategy may not work in this case, but let's think about how we integrate it in the next. And them also pushing back. And this is a very white dominant culture type of strategy that you're pursuing. And this is why it's problematic. And so we only do ourselves a better service when we're honest and get into that deep relationship.
Anyone else want to share what you've been chatting about?
Can we just chat more?
There is plenty of time to chat over the next few days, yeah. But I guess I'm curious personally, because I'm learning every day. All the staff here are, and I know I took a lot of notes during the panel. Okay, Stacy, I see some movement.
Well, I can't just let Pascal take the whole room, right? So no, I could, and I could. I think all of these conversations kind of overlap with each other a little bit. So we were talking mostly. We put this down because I'm short and I can't see over this. Engaging your board of directors, and we have a really wide range of experiences just at this table with folks who have really engaged boards, and folks who are ready to lead and dig in and get uncomfortable, and folks who are really not. And who are really uncomfortable being uncomfortable and not willing or interested in doing some of that work. And so we were really trying to just sort of share strategies about how you could be in Alaska and needing to fly your board members from places, which isn't something Delaware might need to even think about, but whether, right? So we're in really, literally different places, but that our board of directors, as our organizational leadership, really need to be involved in the work, and that can, as staff, can be challenging. But the thing that, at least for me, that I took away from this was Melvin's comment in the panel, which is that it's a journey, and that we are trying really, like, there's no end, there's no finish line, there is no medal, and we just have to, like, be honest with ourselves that it's hard to sometimes do some of this, and that making a commitment to what's the one thing we're going to do next week, right? Like, even though we've said we're going to do this stuff, like, really doing it, so that we can hold ourselves accountable, and that when we come back to the cohort or the next convening, we have some, real concrete things to say that we've done.
Thank you, Stacy. So let's jump over to that question, which is, what is the thing you plan to do next? Did anyone fill in that on their worksheet or are prepared to say it out loud? Go ahead.
So I actually did it. I'm so excited. I raised my hand. I have a thing. I have 2 specific people to email and call, and a specific thing to put on the board agenda in April, related to membership on the board. So I'm excited about it.
Awesome. And we'll ask you about it at the next state and tribal partner meeting.
You can ask me.
Yes. No one else taking it? All right, we see a couple more hands.
We didn't talk about this at the group, so I'm really throwing this out to the larger group because I'm looking for suggestions. But one of the things that we have begun implementing over the last few years is in our interview protocol, like asking questions about, like, what does race equity mean to you? What does, a series of questions. What I am looking for is ways to get, I would like better questions. Like, those are okay. But it's a little, sometimes it prompts really good discussions, and sometimes it's shitty. And so, pardon my French. And that also is probably discouraging for, mid-level staff who are interviewing for the first time. So anyway, I'm looking for good questions, so hit me up. I'm in Kentucky. Thanks.
So Adrian, I'm just going to share, and this is part of what NLIHC is doing with our cohort, is seeking out those, getting the questions that you all have and then seeking out specific resources. And I know that Monica Joe from one of the California partners had a detailed list of questions they ask at any interview, and we shared that out amongst the cohort. So I can definitely share that with you. And just a reminder to you all, as you have these resources, links, PowerPoints, articles, just to share them with each other and us, so we can compile them as they relate to some of these key themes that we know you're all facing. So thank you for sharing. I think we had, Elena?
Just one super quick thing that I wanted to share in response to that is just one practical example that I experimented with a lot of these in a role where I worked in direct practice and managed emergency housing programs, other housing programs, and so staff turnover, you all may be familiar, is very high in that setting, so we got a lot of opportunity to practice interview questions. But one of the questions that to me yielded the most interesting conversation was asking about people's identities. And I would give a little primer that would basically say we all carry multiple identities, a number of identities. How do you think about the identities that you carry in relation to the community that you would be serving? And it was really interesting to see people's awareness even about their own identities, one, and some people a deeper understanding. It just could really flesh out pretty quickly. People who had thought about this in academic ways versus people who clearly had a lot of experience in diverse settings because they could draw upon examples from their lives. So yeah, that's just one that's worked well for me.
Thanks. And I saw Dave's hand up.
Well, and I appreciate those comments because overlaps. And the irony is not lost. Our topic was engaging and diversifying your membership in your network. And I'm here. This is a presence. And the irony is not lost that I'm another white guy talking about Native Americans. But and we had already planned, what's on my list. I'm bringing Kayla back. Already set her up to come to our annual meeting. Lindsay and Kayla were out in the summer, and what we need to do is engage our members from our 35 TDHEs in these meetings. I would like next year for there to be half a dozen of our membership here to figure out what the commonalities are. We talked yesterday about housing being an issue, not a Native American issue or a racial issue, but being a common issue. And our region has had a lot of success and been at its best when it's thought beyond the 7 states and what's good for Indian country, but also what's good for housing, low-income housing. And this is a group that I really need to have our membership interact with and understand what the benefits are. I mean, that's Kayla and I are going to do a panel in 2 weeks in Denver for our member ownership meeting and say, guys, this is what we are now. We're the tribal partner. We're representing Indian country in a lot of ways, but there's some things here you as low-income housing providers will be amazed at what the resources are, be amazed at what the group discussions have been, be amazed at the welcoming atmosphere. Don't be worried about coming to a meeting that's not all about Indian housing. We sat here 2 weeks ago in this same hotel upstairs, did our annual legislative meeting, and those tend to be very narrowly focused on what the legislative environment is, what bills are coming out this year, things like that, but not larger goals for the organization. Although I will say that the National American Indian Housing Council has graciously continued to acknowledge NLIHC as a big partner, but they haven't gotten to that part of engagement. They're looking to UNIHA as one of the regional organizations as their engagement for the national organization. More on our shoulders to bring the two groups together. But that's our immediate goal. I know Kayla's got her plane tickets. So I think I'm going to check the box on what happens next.
Awesome. One more person want to share about a next step? Silence.
So my table, we had a wide range of different experiences, and we all trying to figure out this work. I think one of the questions that did come up, and we were discussing engaging and diversifying your membership and network, it was around what are some of the resources that are out there to help compensate individuals with lived expertise to become more engaged in this work. All of us who's in this room, we've been compensated by organization to do this work. So how can we identify the resources that are available, or what are some of the steps and the strategies that we can put into place in order to identify that so that we can have a broader range of individuals at these meetings as well as at our tables? So that's a question.
Thank you, Carlene. So we're gonna wrap up. I have a few kind of logistical announcements as we transition from this convening to the bigger policy forum. So first off, just thank you all for participating, many of you over the last couple of days, and for flying from the far reaches of our country to be here in the nation's capital with us, and for all your work leading up to Capitol Hill Day on Thursday. And thanks to the panelists that participated throughout the last couple of days and being willing to give a little extra effort there. Thanks to our state partner caucus board members. Again, if you can just raise your hand for helping to set the agenda today and give us feedback. We just thank them all for that role. So we're going to transition to lunch. Couple things. Brooke here has many Capitol Hill Day packets still to give out to state captains. They look like this. We've printed tons of materials. So please use them. So if you know you're a state captain and you haven't connected with Brooke, you can do that now. If you don't get to do that before the start of the forum, we're moving everything to the Legislative Action Center table, which is red. It has a red tablecloth, so it should be easy to identify, and we'll have the rest of the packets there. We have a box lunch set up right across the hallway. You can come back here to eat, or take that someplace else. And then the start of the forum is at 1 o'clock sharp, and it's going to be packed in that room. We have staff been asked to stand or not even go in. It's going to be very full. So I encourage you to get into that room early for a good seat. And to just make sure that we're ready to start the policy forum and the amazing keynotes on time. And that's happening in the grand ballroom where we had dinner last night for those that were with us. So with that, I will close us out. Thank you all again for joining. Enjoy lunch and the rest of the forum, and we will see you very soon.